Well, hello. So glad to be able to resume this video series. I apologize for having to take about a week off of this series. I've been dealing with a throat infection of some kind, more than likely strep. And so, under doctor's orders, I was told to rest for a week to try to relax vocal cords and everything like that. I think I am, for the most part, better. And so, we're going to kind of pick this series back up, continuing to study the miracles of Jesus. And so we got to talk many moons ago now, about a week and a half ago now. We got to talk about the healing of the demoniac boy as Jesus is coming down from the mountain after his transfiguration. We talked about how this is the start of Jesus' narrative, where he is going to go to Jerusalem for the Passover, and ultimately it's going to be the conclusion of the gospel account as Jesus is crucified and then 3 days later raised again. And so this section of the Gospels that shows the journey to Jerusalem, it's all about this heightened tension between Jesus. We've already seen several times in the Gospels up to this point that Jesus has had conflict, in particular with the Pharisees and the scribes and local religious leaders. And so that tension has already started to build. Now it's going to start to bubble over. Now we're going to start to see even more question about who is this Jesus, who is he trying to be, what is he trying to do, and ultimately what is his purpose. And Jesus has already revealed to his apostles and to us as the readers that he is the Son of Man, that he has come to die for the sake of mankind. And so as we're reading through this, we're still not entirely sure what that means, what the mechanism of that's going to be, but we've had this revealing of what's going to happen. We've had this revealing of Jesus' ultimate death and resurrection that's going to serve the purpose of God's salvation for mankind. And so what's going to happen is that the narrative we're going to look at today is it's really brief. It's actually only in Matthew. And as we're going to look, it's actually probably questionable whether this is a miracle or not anyway. It's possible Jesus is making kind of an odd reference to some of the cultural norms. But this is kind of the start of Jesus going to Jerusalem. There's actually already starting to introduce tension between Jesus and the religious norms of the day. And so if you want to join with me, you can turn over to Matthew chapter 17. This takes place right after the healing of the demoniac boy. And remember what we had read earlier in verse 22, where it says that while they were gathering together in Galilee, Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and he will be raised on the third day." And they were deeply grieved. So Jesus and his disciples, that word gathered together, it's the idea of kind of preparing. It's the idea of almost like a rendezvous, that all of these people are coming together. They're in Capernaum, which has really served as kind of Jesus' home base. More than likely, Peter's house has been kind of the specific home of these apostles and disciples, and everybody's kind of been the center point of a lot of Jesus' teaching and his ministry here. It's where he comes back to. And so now everybody's kind of gathering together. They're preparing, and they are now going to go together for the Passover that's going to take place. And so there's going to be a little bit of teaching, and then in about chapter 19 and 20, we're going to see Jesus physically start to head down to that region. But before that takes place, there's an event that's going to occur that we need to have a little bit of cultural understanding of what's going on here. It says in verse 24 that when they had come to Capernaum, those who collected the 2 drachma tax came to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the 2 drachma tax?" Now, Matthew is assuming his readers understand what this is, and they would, because Matthew is mostly talking to a Jewish audience. His book is the one that's most familiar with the Old Testament scriptures. A lot of discussions about the kingdom, a lot of discussions about Jewish cultural norms that are going on. And so Matthew's readers would just know automatically what this is. And this 2 drachma tax was not a tax to Caesar. This was not a Roman tax. This was actually a Jewish tax that was used for the sake of the temple. And so this tax was used for upkeep. It was used to maintain the temple. It was actually kind of a point of national pride. It actually takes its origin from, if you turn over to Exodus chapter 30 real quick, Moses had actually set this tax up. It wasn't a yearly tax. When Moses set it up, it had become that by this point in time. But Moses had actually set up a tax that was designed to pay for the upkeep of the tabernacle. And so it appears as if during the time of the temple, this tax was carried over. And so in Exodus chapter 30, in verse 12, the Lord speaks to Moses, saying, "When you take a census of the sons of Israel to number them, Then each one of them shall give a ransom for himself to the Lord when you number them, that there may be no plague among them when you number them. This is what everyone who is numbered shall give: half a shekel according to the shekel of the sanctuary. The shekel is 20 gerahs. Half a shekel is a contribution to the Lord. Everyone who is numbered from 20 years old and over shall give the contribution to the Lord. The rich shall not pay more, and the poor shall not pay less than the half shekel when you give the contribution to the Lord to make atonement for yourselves. You shall take the atonement money from the sons of Israel. You shall give it for the service of the tent of meeting, that it may be a memorial for the sons of Israel before the Lord to make atonement for yourselves. So, basically every adult male, which is reckoned in this Jewish area as 20 years old, they would pay a 2 drachma or a half shekel, kind of comparable coins, difference between saying a $50 or 2 quarters, same amount of money. They would pay this tax here in a yearly basis to pay for the upkeep of the temple, to make sure it stays clean, that it's got the proper utensils, that it's got the proper materials for sacrifices, and all these various things. And so this was, part of your Jewish identity. But during this time, typically there were certain exemptions for this. And that was rabbis and religious leaders didn't tend to pay the tax. And so one of the questions that's kind of being asked here is they're coming, these tax collectors are coming, and sometimes you would pay the tax in Jerusalem. That's why when you see the money changers at the temple, that's part of what's going on here, is that you could only pay with certain coins for the 2 drachma tax, and so you had to convert your money to drachmas. But sometimes, for the people that were not going to go to Jerusalem, they would actually kind of send out these tax collectors that would go and get the money as much as a month before the annual Passover, where everybody was supposed to come to Jerusalem. And so that kind of gives us a time frame of this is about a month before the events of Passover and before ultimately the events of Jesus' crucifixion. And so they're coming to Peter and they're saying, okay, Peter, pay your tax, which indicates, I think as a side note, that Peter may be the only disciple who's actually over 20 years old. A lot of times we portray the disciples as very older men, grayed hair and all sorts of different things. I've said this before in a sermon. We talked about this a long time ago at West Oaks. I think more than likely the disciples are actually very young men. And I think this is one of the passages that illustrates this. When Jesus is going to pay this tax, as we're going to see, he only pays a full shekel, enough for 2 people. Himself, because we know that Jesus is over 20 years old. He's about 30 at this time. And Peter is over 20. Peter's the only disciple that's mentioned as being married in this time period. Admittedly, there's no discussion of anybody else's. We know later on many of the disciples are married. But it's very possible that Peter is partly kind of the spokesman of the group because he's the oldest. He's the only one who's kind of officially a man. He's in his young 20s. It's possible these other guys, Andrew, James, John, Nathaniel, all these other guys, are possibly younger than that. And so regardless of whether or not they're what exactly age they are, I think it makes more sense to read the apostles as younger men. I think it kind of explains some of their outbursts, some of their difficulties with Jesus' teaching, and explains why they would want to follow around a rabbi. If you're a 50, 65-year-old man in this context, you wouldn't be a follower of a rabbi. You'd be at your home raising your family and everything. And so that's a side note, but I think that's always one of those things that kind of helps us clarify maybe what's going on in these passages. So the tax collectors ask, they're like, okay, does your teacher not pay the 2 drachma tax? And Peter says, yes. And when he came into the house, Jesus spoke to him first, saying, what do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth collect customs or poll tax? From their sons or from strangers? And upon his saying, from strangers, Jesus said to him, consequently, the sons are exempt. But lest we give them offense, go to the sea and throw in a hook, take the first fish that comes up, and when you open its mouth, you will find a shekel. Take that and give it to them for you and me. Jesus is making a really interesting point here. He's asking, okay, taxes, does a prince get taxed? Does the son of the king get taxed? And no, of course not. That's not how taxes work in this ancient time. Obviously, in modern times, everybody pays taxes, at least theoretically, whether you're the president of the United States or whether you're, a regular individual. But in the days where the king is collecting a tax, the king doesn't charge his own family. They're part of the people receiving the tax. And so Jesus is making a pretty profound point here that he, as the Son of God, as the essentially owner of that temple, as the one who dwells in that temple, as being God in the flesh, he's exempt from paying this tax. He would not be expected to pay this tax. And yet, what does he tell Peter? For the sake of not causing offense, we're going to pay. I think it's a really fascinating point, a really important thing for us to understand as we talk about, particularly in our current context of what's happened over the past 2 weeks, when we talk about the relationship of a Christian and the state, how do we know what's the proper time to give offense? Now, we're going to see later in Jerusalem, Jesus is going to be offensive. Jesus is going to overturn the tables of the money changers. He is going to call out the Pharisees and the Sadducees as false teachers. He's going to identify Herod as a fox. There's going to be times where Jesus is going to be offensive. And that's going to be the times where there's a direct contradiction between what people are doing and what God's will is. But he's also demonstrating that there's a time to let it slide. There's a time to not make, maybe to use a modern idiom, a mountain out of a molehill. Jesus knows that he's not under obligation to pay this tax because of who he is. He's the Son of God. But because he doesn't want to make a bigger issue, because this isn't the thing he wants to fight over, this isn't what he wants to focus on, he says, you know what, I will submit my freedom from this in order to avoid offending people over this subject. I think that's a profound lesson for us who today have a lot of freedom as the sons of God, who have freedom to act in many ways in what we see best fits the gospel. And so when we question, is it time to act defensively? Is it time to cause a stir and to identify the problems in our society? I think this is a good litmus test for us. Is this something that we just don't want to do? Is this something that it's just kind of inconvenient for us to do? And clearly it's inconvenient for Jesus and Peter. They don't have the money for this. There's a reason that Jesus is telling Peter, hey, go to a fish and go grab a piece of money. Jesus has already told the disciples, you don't have any money. You're not carrying money bags. You're not accumulating wealth. People have been providing for them. So Jesus and his disciples are poor. They don't have the money for this tax. So Jesus could easily say, hey, we don't have any money. It's not convenient for us to do this. And we don't have to do this, so we're not going to. And yet, in spite of it being inconvenient, and in spite of having the liberty to not pay this by rights, Jesus submits his comfort and his convenience for the sake of not causing offense, because this is a minor issue. And so the miracle here is that, he causes this drachma to appear in the mouth of a fish. Now, it's interesting to note that the text actually doesn't say that Peter does this. And so there's been people that have theorized maybe Jesus is kind of making light of the situation. I think that's probably reading a little bit too much into the text. It is interesting to see that Peter doesn't do this, or at least it's not recorded for us, but it may just be that we're supposed to assume that that's what Peter does, and he then pays the tax. But the more important point of this, I think, is understanding when it's time to offend, when it's time to make a scene. When it's something that offends us, when it's something that inconveniences us personally, submit. Say, okay, well, I don't have to do this, but I'm going to submit my liberty for the sake of peace with people. But when it's time to offend, when it's time to call out the values of this world and the actions of people as incongruent with what God has prescribed, that's the time where you can't stay quiet. That's the time where you can't submit. That's the time where, because of our submission to God, we have to speak out. And I think that's the valuable lesson that this miracle is teaching us, is that use discernment, use wisdom on what battles we're going to fight. There's a lot of things in this world that we may have liberty to do and that we may have a right to do, but it may not be the best thing to do for the sake of the kingdom of God. And so there's going to be plenty of those battles. There's going to be plenty of times where we are going to have to be offensive for the sake of the gospel. Choose those wisely. Be discerning in whether you can submit and not bother the system for the sake of submission, not out of cowardice, but because some battles are not worth fighting. And those battles that they just affect us, those are the battles that are probably not worth fighting. The battles that affect people's relationship with God, the battles where God is being dishonored, those are the battles we have to stand up for. And I think that's what this miracle helps us to gain a perspective on. All appreciate so much you taking the time to listen to this. Again, it's good to kind of get back into the flow of these things. I'm hoping my voice is not harmed by doing this, and I'll be able to continue doing these over the next couple of days. We've still got several really important miracles that are going to take place. A lot of the gospel from here on out is going to be more teaching and more of kind of Jesus talking about things. And so we have definitely passed the bulk of the miracles. There is going to be a lot of talking, a lot of teaching from here on out. But there are going to be some really important miracles that take place that kind of link all of this teaching together. And so we are going to continue to talk about that probably about another week, maybe another week and a half of looking at these things. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us for these things. I hope it's beneficial. I hope these videos, hopefully, maybe you've missed these videos, and hopefully it's good that they are back. But we're so thankful for the continued support. We're thankful for the prayers for my healing over this. And so thank you so much for taking the time. We cannot wait to see you next time. Thank you so much.